Welcome to the world according to Boyar, where we bring top investors, best-selling authors, and market newsmakers to show you the smartest ways to uncover value in the stock market. I'm your host, Jonathan Boyar. Our guest today is David Zaslav, President and CEO of Discovery Communications. Prior to joining Discovery, David worked at NBC, where he's credited with launching both CNBC and MSNBC. David is here to talk about his fascinating career, as well as the launch of Discovery's latest initiative, Discovery Plus. The Boyar Value Group has been following Discovery since 2006, shortly after it was spun out of Liberty Media. In full disclosure, clients of Boyar Asset Management, as well as myself, are Discovery shareholders. What attracted us to Discovery is the power of its brands and global reach. It's available in 220 countries, 50 languages, and delivers 8,000 hours of original programming each year. Best of all, from an investment standpoint, unlike its competition, most of its content translates well internationally, so it's able to spread the cost of its programming over its global subscriber base. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me.
Thanks for being on. I'm really excited. And first, I just want to talk about early on in your career. You were a young lawyer in Manhattan in the 80s, and you were reading a trade publication. And I guess you saw an article discussing how NBC, which at the time was really just a broadcast company, wanted to get into cable, and you did something quite unusual. What did you do?
I had started out as a corporate lawyer, and I was at a great firm, and I was busy working away, writing prospectuses, but I knew in my heart that I didn't love it. I didn't think I was actually that great at it. I was working real hard at it. But a partner transferred into the law firm. He was general counsel at Warner Communications, and he represented MTV and CNN and Discovery and Nickelodeon. And I started in this kind of my spare time doing extra work in that area. And I loved it. And so more and more, I was doing work. The partner's name is Richard Berman. He's a federal court judge now in New York. Wonderful guy. I loved working with him. I got a sense of the industry. I loved it. So I started subscribing and reading everything I could about it. Subscribed to The Hollywood Reporter and broadcasting and cable and multi-channel news. And one day, on the cover was Jack Welch and Bob Wright. Bob Wright was the chairman of NBC at the time, and GE had just bought NBC. And NBC really was the center of the universe. Broadcast was all that mattered at the time, and cable was just getting started. And in fact, all the cable program services at the time were losing money. It was an experiment. Really, it was all in the startup phase. And Jack was on the cover with Bob saying that he thought cable was part of the future, and he wanted to figure out how to get it. He was going to get NBC into the cable business. So I wrote a letter to them saying, I've been doing a lot of work for MTV and Nickelodeon and Discovery, and I love the cable business. This is what I want to do with my life. If you're going to go down this road, I'd love to be on the journey with you. And Jack wrote on the top, bring this guy in. Let's take a look at him. And in retrospect, it was a handwritten letter at the time. I just thought this was a way to maybe get a shot. Looking at it now, I think it's pretty astonishing that they read it and they brought me in. But it was the beginning of a great journey. I got very close to Jack, learned a ton from him, learned a ton from Bob Wright. It was kind of an all-star cast at NBC. So I was quite lucky to be involved in NBC at the very beginning when they were starting cable, and to be around such a great and smart group of people, because it had a big influence on me and how I saw the world.
You took a pretty big risk. I mean, you were a corporate lawyer at one of these white shoe firms, and I think you took a pay cut, right, to do this?
Yeah, I took a big pay cut. I knew when I was doing the corporate work that I just didn't love it. And it was hard for me. We all think we're good at everything, but it was difficult. You had to write these prospectuses. You had to comply with all these different regulations. It would get sent to the SEC and reviewed. And I looked around at the partners and I just thought, I'm not sure that's what I want to be. But in many ways, I was stuck. I had an apartment and they were paying me a lot of money. And my life raft was Richard Berman, that I somehow, by luck, I got exposed to the cable and media business and got the bug. But it was a no-brainer to me to leave and take a pay cut, just because I felt like I want to be doing stuff that I really like. I was passionate about cable. I really believed in it. And getting in early stage, in retrospect, there was no experts. There were experts in every area on the broadcast side. There were no experts in cable. So I got to do a lot more and I got to expand. But I did take a 50% pay cut, and they all thought I was crazy. And there were times when I thought I was crazy. There were times when we launched CNBC, at that time, since all the businesses were losing money, we tried to structure our attack on cable by using partnerships to limit our downside risk. So Jack was like, we got to find a partner. So we found Chuck Dolan from Cablevision. So we partnered with almost everything with Chuck. In the beginning, Chuck owned 50% of CNBC. We were 50-50 partners. And we owned a big piece of Bravo and AMC and what was called Romance Classics, which is now We launched together after a big analysis that we launched News 12 Long Island, the first regional news network. We did an analysis that said this was the biggest contiguous population that doesn't have its own news. I wonder if a local news network, cable network could work. So we launched News 12 Long Island. And each of those we did as partners together. But during those first few years, I got there in 88. By 91, every single one of them was losing money. As 92 came, we did a very bold experiment with the Olympics called the pay-per-view. We offered it on pay-per-view, also in partnership with Chuck Dolan. And they had this big thing at Boca for GE with all the GE leaders, which Jack presided over. And that year, CNBC, all of our investments with Chuck were losing money, and the pay-per-view Olympics lost $100 million, which was a huge amount of money at that time. It was a real experiment in will people pay for content specifically. So everything was losing money. We lost $100 million on that. And I remember I was heading down to Boca, and the whisper from Ohlmeyer, who, great guy, he passed away about a year ago, but a brilliant entertainment executive. He always used to say when we'd go up and present to GE that for the cost of what we're losing on what Zaslav's doing, I could have done 4 more pilots. And at the time, that argument was, you're nuts, Jack. I could have done 4 more pilots. We could have had 2 more great primetime series for what we're wasting there. And we were heading down to Boca, and Don was convinced that not only was this going to be my last Boca, but I wasn't going to come out of there, that everything was losing money. And that year, Jack gave an award for innovation. And I got the GE award for innovation. And those guys, they were laughingly, we were all friends, cracking up, like innovating by losing money on everything that he's involved in. But Jack was trying to make a point. This stuff is hard. We were making progress. We were fighting the fight. We went from 20 million subs to 30 to 40. There were only direct response advertisers in. We were fighting to get real advertisers into cable. We were able to stand up a news network with CNBC that we were proud of. We did a local news network with News 12. We tried a lot of things that didn't work, but we learned from it. And he really wanted to drive this idea of risk and innovation. Now, over dinner about a month later, when I was talking to him and we were cracking up that Ohlmeyer thought that I wasn't going to get out of Boca with my job, he said, you got a year or 2 to turn this around or you're not going to have a job. So it was a double-edged sword always with Jack. We need risk and innovation. It needs to be measured. When things don't work, let's talk about what's not working. Let's figure out what we learned from it and how we can do things differently to succeed. But ultimately, it was a business. And we got very lucky because when it turned, and it turned when the number of subs started to scale, at the same time, subscriber fees were growing, subs were growing, and it became, Tom Freston did a great job with MTV, and Turner got turned around with Malone's help on CNN, and it became the cool place to hang out. And once MTV really hit its stride and CNN hit its stride, then advertisers wanted to be there. And when they wanted to be there, we went from selling Ginsu knives to selling Ford Mustang convertibles. And so we got advertising and CPMs increasing, and we got subs increasing and fees increasing. We had a great run for over a decade in the cable business. Really just an extraordinary run.
You mentioned Chuck Dolan, who is obviously a pioneer in this. He was responsible for the starting of HBO, et cetera. He was your partner on, I guess, what came into CNBC, but he left right as you were buying FNN out of bankruptcy.
It just shows you how precarious at the time. There was times when we would go up to GE. We didn't know if GE was going to continue to fund CNBC. It was losing so much money. And what happened was when we launched CNBC, we actually wanted to launch a news network. But in order to launch, we needed to get the cable operators to support us. So they sent me to meet with Malone. I went with Bob Wright and a guy named Tom Rogers, and we met with John Malone. And I was the little guy holding all the materials and the presentations. And we talked to John about launching a news network. But John immediately, he had just bailed out Turner, and he was an investor in Turner and Headline. He said, we got two news networks that we're putting a lot of resources against. But FNN at the time was doing a lot of infomercials during the day. So you couldn't tell the difference between an actual news segment and something that was sponsored as like an infomercial by Charles Schwab or by Solomon Brothers at the time. And John, we were in his office and he pointed to it. He goes, you see that? That's like an infomercial. We need original content in cable. And we need to build content that people believe is credible, that they can believe in, that can count on. That was what he and Ted were trying to do with CNN. And so he said, if you're willing to do a business news network with real investment and integrity, I would support that. And so we went there thinking we were going to launch a news network, and we left with a business news network. And that's how we did CNBC. But then a few years later, we were at like 25 million homes, and FNN was at like 25 million homes. John had launched us. We had gotten a lot of other operators, not all of them. And we were both really struggling. And so they went into bankruptcy, and we were negotiating against the Wall Street Journal to buy them. And we felt that we needed them to survive. And we went up to Jack to make a presentation out of what we can do if we put these two together and why we needed this to save CNBC. And we had this big deck with all kinds of detail of return on investment and what we could pay. And Jack said, put that all away. The real question is, if we could own business news, if we do this deal and we own business news, is it a business? Is it a real business that we could be proud of? Is it a business that we can make money on? Is it a business? And at the time, we couldn't answer that question. We had to come back to answer that question. And he said, because if we go at this, we can't lose. The GE philosophy at that time was if we were going to get into this auction, we weren't going to lose. And so we came back and we talked about it. We really had a strong belief that we could build a real business around it, and we could build it globally. And so we went into the bankruptcy court, into the Wild West of the bankruptcy court, and we bid against the Wall Street Journal, and we ended up getting it. And at that time, they were about to hit the gavel, and we called Chuck, and Chuck decided he wasn't with us. And it did give us some trepidation because Chuck had created HBO. We were partners on almost everything. He's super brilliant, but he didn't see it. He didn't see that business news was a business. And we went anyway. We then owned 100% of it. And it turns out it was a good business. And Chuck was right about almost everything else over the years that we worked on together. But he exited that. And we ended up restructuring our whole partnership years later, where we took Bravo and he took the rest of those assets. And so it was very fruitful. And Jim Dolan was involved, and it worked very well, the partnership.
Absolutely. And obviously the Dolans are, I think, much better operators than people give them credit for. And around the same time, they ended up buying Madison Square Garden for a few $100 million. So they did have other good returns, I guess, at the same time.
I think Chuck and Jimmy are underrated. They had a lot of innovation, great operators, and great value creators. So we had a chance to trail along with them for a while, which was fun.
You'd mentioned John Malone, and you're fortunate to have him as your largest shareholder, at least in terms of voting rights. When you want to make a deal like buying Scripps, how do you use someone like him as a resource and a sounding board? I know he's on your board of directors, but it's more than that.
Look, I've been around John now for 15 years, but I met him when we did the deal to start CNBC over 30 years ago. He's got the most brilliant strategic mind, I think, maybe of anybody in business. As I said earlier, I think you're so defined by who you get to hang out with. Somehow I got extraordinarily lucky. I got to spend 15 years with Jack Welch, and I've spent the last 15 with John Malone. You could argue very different. Jack may be probably the greatest operating business leader maybe in history, and John, the greatest investor and maybe most brilliant strategic thinker. John has the ability to see how everything comes together, and he has conviction in, for instance, he saw way before anyone else that the real value to cable was broadband, not the cable. And so he, together with Mike Freeze, went and rolled up most of Europe and a lot of Latin America by buying cable systems. But he had full conviction that whatever he was paying was really a discount because the broadband wasn't being valued, and the broadband was the value. But he's been a great mentor to me. It's a gift that I get to talk to him.
I hope you are enjoying the interview with David Zaslav. To be sure you never miss another World According to Boyar episode, please follow us on Twitter @BoyarValue. Now back to the show. Speaking of value creation, I look at a company like Viacom, who for years basically plowed almost all their free cash flow into share buybacks instead of investing in content. And their current content quality kind of reflects that. And so what was it like for you when you bought Scripps and Wall Street puts you in the penalty box for a deal that in the long run is so much better for the company than simply shrinking your share count? Like, how do you manage through periods like that? It has to be extremely difficult.
No, it's really not. We have our public shareholders and we have the Newhouse family who really are long-term investors, and they're really driven by quality, investing in quality and long-term growth. And Malone is the same way. We don't have any conversations with either of them about what a rating was on a Friday or what this quarterly number was. It's what is our long-term strategic strategy? And that alignment, I think, has made us really entrepreneurial. It allowed we very quickly. So at GE, and GE was very different than operating this company as a CEO of a public company with two investors that are aligned in long-term growth. The deal that we did with Oprah, for GE, that might have been a month and all kinds of analysis. We saw Oprah. We thought we could build a great network around her, that she's a great curator, value. She was all in. And that was one conversation, and boom, we're converting Discovery Health into the Oprah Winfrey Network. I thought that owning the Olympics and all of Europe on top of Eurosport and owning it for a decade could create real value. And we're very aligned. That decision was made very quickly. What we've done in the last 5 years is we've transformed our company from a free-to-air and cable company where we were very successful because we had 10 to 12 channels in every country, free-to-air channels, and content that worked well, as you mentioned, around the world. But we recognized pretty early, and John was quick to kind of raise this issue, that we were growing 10 to 15%. Our market share was never higher. Our stock price was never higher. And our free cash flow was growing. This is about 6 years ago. And we were talking about how well everything's going. And John said, how well would we do with our content if people could watch anything? How many would still watch us? At that point, there's 40 channels in France. We had 10 of them. And so we had all this beachfront real estate. So we had a really unique advantage that a lot of people were watching us and liked us, but we weren't necessarily their first choice. Maybe we were the third choice. And so we had this whole debate about the world is going between DVR and mobile screens, that people are going to be able to choose to watch anything they want. And so this strategic advantage of these channels and beachfront real estate was going to be eroded over time. We had to stop looking at ourselves as a cable and free-to-air company that bought content to fill that time. And our question became, whenever we did a program deal or bought content, was, is this content that people would watch before they'd watch anything? And that's why we, after that conversation, we went and we bought Eurosport, which was investing like 100 million in sports. We took that to 300 or 400 million a year. We bought most of the cycling. We bought all the majors in tennis. We invested in local sports in Europe. We started transforming the way we produce content for our channels. We wanted fewer, bigger, better. We need more content that people care about when they could watch anything. And over the next couple of years, that got really refined as the world got sharper and moved quicker than even we thought, because I think we were the earliest mover in this direction. We early on said we're going to own all of our IP globally. We're going to upgrade the IP we have. We're going to buy content that people want to watch when they could watch anything. But then we had to ask the question, what content do we own that people will pay for before they'll pay for dinner? It wasn't good enough that they would choose us over anybody else for free. What do we have that's so important that they'll pay for that before they'll pay for dinner? And sports in the Olympics we thought was important with that. That's why we went so hard against Chip and Joe. That's why we did the Scripps deal. People saw the Scripps deal as a deal that we were buying a cable channel business that over time was going to decline. What we loved is we looked and we saw that they owned all their IP. They had no participants. There were really no competitors in the food and home space. They hadn't taken it international. We were in every country, and we had the ability to proliferate that content on existing channels or launch channels. But more importantly, we were looking to launch a global platform. And we saw home, food, cooking, and travel and DIY as a massive IP library that also had huge appeal to families, to women. And we looked at it and we thought, and it also was very strong in terms of how well it worked around the world. And so we viewed the Scripps deal as an acquisition of brands, characters, and most importantly, IP. And when we put our IP together with theirs, that we would be pretty formidable. And for a very long time, we've seen the world differently than most media companies, because most of media has been attracted to this idea of scripted series and scripted movies, which is a lot of fun. And it's pretty sexy. And there's a lot of big stars. For me, I'm very driven by data, and I'm driven by viewership patterns. That's how we decided to launch ID, a crime channel. We took a look at what people are actually watching, what's making CBS so successful, what do people love? They love crime. May not be sexy, but we launched it, and it was the #1 channel for women in America with crime. So every time we looked at the viewership data and the analytical data, it said to us that more than 50 or 55% of what people watch is not scripted series and scripted movies. That we have a real game here if we could take the level up of Discovery and Animal Planet and Food and HG and TLC and ID and Oprah, that this real life entertainment, that maybe when you ask somebody, what did you watch this weekend that you loved? Maybe they'll say The Crown. But when you actually look at the data, they spent more time watching 90 Day Fiancé. And when you look at the social data, what are people talking about online? There's much more social energy against 90 Day Fiancé or Chip and Joanna Gaines than there is against The Undoing, which is an unbelievable series on HBO. And so there was a real fork in the road over the last couple of years with a gold rush, effectively, of 7 great media companies fighting over scripted series and scripted movies. And we may be wrong. And this is where John was completely on board, that let's just follow the data. If for the last 25 years, people have spent 50 or 55% of their time watching this content that we have in these genres that we love, and 45 to 50% on scripted series and scripted movies, do we think that over the next 10 years, when there's a more aggressive transition to acquiring content and consuming content and paying for content, that they're only going to consume and pay for the scripted series and scripted movies and behaviorally not still want the stuff that they're spending half of their time with now? And so in essence, that's been our bet. And we're going to see if we're right. We just launched Discovery Plus. We did a deal with the BBC to get their entire natural history library with all the great titles, Planet Earth and Frozen Planet and Blue Planet. Most of those we worked on with them. We're producing a lot of new content with the BBC that'll be exclusive globally with us. We did a deal with History and A&E and Lifetime to get some of their best content in, with a mission of, let's see if we can own, let's see if we could be this broad, compelling entertainment offering in these content genres that are not scripted series and scripted movies. And we think it's a great companion, if we're right, then this will be the companion that if you have Netflix or Disney, then you have Discovery Plus. If you have HBO, they're all great, but they're not all going to survive. Disney and Netflix now, they're above the globe. They have real scale, and you got to admire what they've been able to accomplish. And you got 6 or 7 other players trying to compete. I think those that compete in the US only are going to have a very difficult time. I don't see in the long run how that really works. Ultimately, being able to offer IP globally and the scale of that and the efficiency of it is so compelling that I think it's hard to compete otherwise. But those are great companies and they're fighting that out. If we're right, not only are we a great companion to each of them, kind of a reaggregating of the bundle, but most of those services don't have content that by their very nature, it's not a companion. People get up in the morning and they put on Food Network or they put on HG or they put on ID. The same way somebody gets up in the morning and they put on the Today Show.
You had just said Discovery Plus is complementary to Disney Plus and Disney and Netflix. Is there a chance of ever bundling them together, or does having Discovery Plus as a standalone kind of service kind of preclude that?
Well, nothing's precluded. What consumers are doing is they're doing their own bundling. In a way, the basic cable bundle worked really well for so many years because even though it was 250 channels, the average person only watches 5 or 6 channels. And so when you put that clicker in your hand, each person in the family curated differently. Each person had their own 5 or 6 channels, and that worked very well. What we believe is there'll be a reclustering. In the end, there's not going to be 20 apps, and you're going to be sitting there on Google saying, what's what? There'll probably be some consolidation on the scripted series and scripted movie side. And we think that there's going to be times that you want to watch Star Wars or you want to watch the next season of The Crown. And there's going to be times you want to watch Bobby Flay and Guy Fieri, and you want to see Oprah doing a Super Soul session about what life's going to be like after the pandemic, or Chip and Jo. And so we think we're part of a concentric circle. We've just taken our space. And I think the consumer themselves will be reaggregating. But I also see that it's not unlikely that some of us come together in packaging. So we're $4.99, somebody else is $6.99, but together you can get us for $7.99. And then you go with that other programmer. We have to figure out what's the secret sauce of what's the right basic cable. Got it. How do we put it all together in one place and charge? One of the problems is that, at least in the US, the price just kept going up. And unlike the US, every other market doesn't have sports in basic. And so it got very, very expensive. But there'll be a rebundling. And it's not unlikely that a year or two from now, if we get to big scale, there'll probably be a lot of players that say to us, can we bundle with you? Can we come in with you? We'd love to get access to your millions of subscribers. Or would we love to be bundled with Disney or Netflix? Over time, that could make a lot of sense. It might make a lot of sense for them too. We're probably the best at what we do. And ultimately, I think either by the consumer doing it or by us coming together or by consolidation of those that are too small, ultimately there'll be a rebundling that'll make it more efficient and easier for consumers.
You mentioned consolidation. I mean, I was looking back at our reports from 2006 and 2008, and you had the precedent transactions. BET went for 24 times, Bravo 23 times, Comedy Central 29 times. And today you're seeing really good companies trading at much more modest multiples. What happened to the good old days?
What happened was, in those days, the industry was a train track, and it went on forever. And so all we did in those days was try and build the biggest train or the widest train or the fastest train. And so we pay a big multiple for BET. Someone will pay a big multiple for Bravo because the view was it's going to make my train faster to go on this track, and the track's going to go on forever. Well, the phones that are all TV sets and the cost of cable content and the appeal of being able to put together your own content of everything you want to watch made it pretty clear that that was not going to go on forever. And so it went from growing double digit to slight growth to flat to declining. We think it's going to decline slower than people think, but that track's not going to go on forever. There's a whole demographic that doesn't get an apartment right now, and day one have to wait for cable to get hooked up because they got their phone and they have Broadband may be more important than cable to a lot of people at this point. So the world is changing in a meaningful way. And the real question on multiple is the multiple compressed because when you look at the terminal value, nobody could really predict how fast will it decline? How much longer are people going to be watching on sets in their TV on a cable, based on a cable or free-to-air offering? And so Disney is broken out because Disney has proven, because of their IP, their global IP, and offering it on Disney Plus, that they are a global IP company. They are not a cable and free-to-air company. We're still valued as if we are a global cable and free-to-air company. We're in every country, virtually every country in the world, in every language. Our share is still growing. Last year, we had over $3 billion in free cash flow. Domestically and internationally, I think we outperformed everyone, really, and commercially and from a viewership perspective. But we're trading at half the multiple we were trading at a few years ago. And that's not unfair, because no matter how great of a job we do, if we could outperform every quarter, the fact that subscribers are declining here in the US and they're declining a little bit outside the US, and behaviorally people are watching more content off of the traditional platform, it's fair to say that when there's some uncertainty and that the value should go down. And so our whole mission with Discovery Plus is there's only two global IP companies, and that's Netflix and Disney. We're the only other global IP company in the world. So we're one of three. The difference between us is we have different content than them. The advantage we have is we actually have content in every language in the world. And we have boots on the ground in every country. We have relationships. We understand culturally each country. So if you said what company has more local content in every country in the world, we'd be number one. Our mission is to prove that we're not a cable and free-to-air company, although we're proud of that. And we're outperforming in that free cash flow and that continued good performance. We think is going to be a real engine for us for a long period of time in terms of funding and growth to shareholders. But if we can scale Discovery Plus above the globe, then if we can prove that people will pay for our content, that 50% that's not scripted series and scripted movies, then we'll be a global IP company. And then all of a sudden, we got a train track that goes on forever again. Because if we have a relationship with consumers around the world with unique content, unique brands, and unique stories, then it goes on forever. And that's why Netflix is valued so high, because they're a train on a track that goes on forever. And our mission is that our traditional business is more like a boat now that had a river with a current with it. And now the current's moved against it, but we're adding engines and firepower to kind of power through it. But ultimately, the current is against us. If we can take all of our global IP and with Discovery Plus, build a real global IP business, then the value creation for our shareholders will be enormous.
And when you bought Scripps a few years ago, how close to what it is now, like with Discovery Plus, did you envision it? Was this all part of like kind of a master plan of putting everything together, or have you had to pivot kind of along the way?
No, it's been pretty close. One, we thought that together with Scripps, we could be the number one media company in America for women. So we thought that it was a very good proposition for the ability to market more broadly to women. We had TLC and we had ID, but now we have the top 5 channels in America for women, plus the number one channel for African American women. We thought that even in the traditional marketplace, was going to be advantageous. But we started producing content almost 2 years ago for Discovery Plus. So when we launched with 55 original series, we've had in mind all along that we need great original content on Discovery Plus. When we closed on Scripps, the first visit I made was to Waco, Texas, figure out how do you get Chip and Joanna Gaines back with us, because there's just not that many great, authentic characters that America loves. And Chip and Jo also have an ability to curate content that people love. And that's the secret sauce of what we are. We're not just great brands and great stories. We're the characters that you love. And there's just not that many great, charismatic, authentic characters that people love. And as you look around, whether it's Martha or Oprah or Chip and Jo or Mike Rowe or Guy Fieri or Bobby Flay, you look around at our portfolio, and I think that's another differentiator for us. And I think in the long run, that's going to help. And it also helps people curate when they come to our platform. some of these streaming services, we noticed people go there and they go, okay, what do I do now? What do I watch? And it creates some anxiety. And even in the research, a lot of people said, I don't need more content, because they just are going to these platforms and there's just lists of series. What the hell do I do? Iger and Chapek were very clever in the way that they organized Disney Plus. It's almost very retro. They organized Disney Plus and then they basically put 5 logos out. And those 5 logos are like the 5 channels that you love on your cable system. There's 250 channels, but what am I getting when I get Discovery Plus? When I get Disney Plus, I'm getting Pixar, I'm getting Star Wars, I'm getting Marvel, I'm getting Disney family movies, I'm getting Nat Geo. And it's a very calming effect, but it also is very inviting from a curation perspective. I'm in the mood to see some Disney family movies, so you go through that portal. And I think that's a big advantage for Disney. Netflix has a different model where they've just been able, with their algorithm, to be very effective about recommending things to you. And they're so successful that their friends recommend things to you.
You've been more than generous with your time. And you had mentioned Disney, and they have a great business model in that they own great IP, but they're able to further monetize it with merchandise and theme parks. Have you ever thought of some sort of partnership or joint venture, as lots of your content would do great in that kind of ecosystem, or could you do it alone? Because you are a global IP company and you should be able to monetize it even further and get that premium multiple.
For us, I think we have such an efficient model on the cost of our content, the speed to market. We don't have any participants. We own all of our content 100%. We have a factory that converts it into 52 languages. The efficiency, we're generating over $3 billion in free cash flow last year. Our margins remaining very strong. For us, I think Disney is a great merchandising company, and they do have theme parks and hotels and all this other great stuff. For us, if 3 years from now or 4 years from now, Discovery Plus is a full-on scaled global IP offering, Discovery will be a huge company, because on the left side, we have this traditional business that's a free cash flow machine that's growing, that has brands and characters people love. And if we could prove that we're a global IP company, I think then we'll be one of the sustainable winners, and we'll likely be one of the players that people look to tuck in with.
David, I really want to thank you for your time. I love learning more about your career and especially the exciting things you're doing with Discovery Plus. Thanks for being on The World According to Boyar.
Thank you, Jonathan.